It's been a while, so here we go again with another amazing McWayne's Class production. Um, this podcast is for notes regarding the civil rights movement, and for the purposes of our class, the way we have approached this is we've just finished up World War II, and we watched a movie, The Tuskegee Airmen, and we introduced the idea that um, people who were not white men, minorities, I guess, um, fought fought bravely for the United States, fought bravely to protect the idea and the ideals of the United States: equality, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, even though they didn't necessarily enjoy those rights, those liberties here in the United States. So they fought to protect the ideas, the ideals, even though they didn't have that luxury. Um, for the purpose of the notes, there are some notes that are highlighted that I would say are more important than others. The blanks for these notes you will definitely need as far as testing goes. I would ask that you try to complete all of the notes because then they will just make more sense. After listening to this podcast, there are a number of standards that you will be uh, at least partially familiar with. You will know the historical context of key people and events. You will be able to describe examples of citizens and groups who have influenced change, and you will be able to examine ways citizens may have effectively voiced opinions. So, without further ado, we're going to start by going all the way back to the Emancipation Proclamation. The, the Emancipation Proclamation was in 1863, and this is the statement where Lincoln freed the slaves. Now, just because he freed the slaves didn't really do a whole lot. It required the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States in 1868 to provide equal protection of the law. Now, so 1868, everybody's supposed to have equal protection of the law, but there were instances in which people were not protected. And actually, a court case, a very important court case, the court case of Homer Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, established the idea that conditions could be separate but equal. In other words, this legalized segregation, the ability to separate people or offer separate services. Now, the next concept and the next thing I want you all to know about is the NAACP. NAACP. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People began to challenge laws that allowed segregation in education. 1909, they began to say, wait a second, this is not right. In the 1920s, a man by the name of A. Philip Randolph created a union. He was a railroad worker, created a union called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This was important because it created the idea that strength came from unity. And yes, most of these workers happened to be African American. This same gentleman, A. Philip Randolph, continued this idea of strength through unity, through union, in 1941 when he threatened to protest the segregation in the military and in defense jobs. A very important concept. Ultimately, he met with the President of the United States, and they agreed if we ended segregation in the military and in the defense jobs, then there would be no protest. So he was a major figure. Now, the next person I want to talk about is Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson became the first African American player in the major leagues in 1947, and we've spoken a little bit about that already. Thurgood Marshall became the chief lawyer for the NAACP, and he would argue a very important case called Brown versus the Board of Education in 1952, which will effectively end segregation in the schools. But more about that in a little bit. The next gentleman, Nat King Cole. I've put this gentleman on the list of major points in the civil rights movement because this is the first television show hosted by an African American in 1956. We've talked about the importance of radio and the importance of jazz music for spreading culture. Now we have television in 1956, and we have an African American gentleman on the screen. So just think about the impact there as far as spreading the ideas of different cultures. Now, the next highlighted portion, major event, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Now, I mentioned in 1952, Thurgood Marshall argued the case. It was in 1954 that a decision was made. And the decision here was that separate schools were not and could not be equal. Effectively, this showed that segregation actually violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Remember, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, way back in 1868, meant that there had to be equal protection of the law. And so segregation actually violated this. So schools could be integrated. Again, this is where the whole idea of the Little Rock Nine comes in, the assignment that you've already started. Now, just because the court voted on this does not mean that there wasn't conflict. In Arkansas, where Little Rock is, in 1957, Governor Orville Faubus refused to comply with integration or mixing of people. President Eisenhower, the same president that led Operation Torch and led the D-Day invasion, had to actually send federal troops to protect the African American students. And there was protest. Protest over people not recognizing that segregation needed to end. Rosa Parks is the first person we're going to talk about here. In 1955, she refused to give up her seat to a white person. African Americans were supposed to sit at the back of the bus. Rosa Parks was an African American woman, and she refused to give up and offer her seat to a white person who wanted her seat. This started one of the first major protests of the civil rights era, known as the Montgomery Bus Boycott. A boycott is when you refuse to use a service. Martin Luther King gained notoriety for helping lead the bus boycott. The idea was, hey, if none of the African Americans in Montgomery use the public bus service, if they don't pay for it, eventually the bus service is going to run out of money and they'll have to say, all right, you can sit wherever you want. Anyway, Martin Luther King gained notoriety, gained fame for helping lead this bus boycott. He believed in non-violent resistance, an idea that he got from a gentleman named Mahatma Gandhi. Some of these non-violent resistance efforts involved sit-ins and voter registration drives. voter registration drives. Hopefully that makes sense. How do you make changes? You have to vote. In order to vote, you have to register to vote. And he got the idea of marches. His idea of marches for protests goes back to A. Philip Randolph, the gentleman we talked about earlier. Students were a major player in the civil rights movement. They were active, they were impatient, and they were full of energy. They practiced civil disobedience. That means they refused to obey the law, but not just all laws, laws that they felt were unjust. Civil disobedience, refusal to obey unjust laws. Another group was called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This group taught protection strategies and identified targets for protests, and they prepared African Americans for the struggle. Now, one of the more interesting protests and one of the more interesting strategies was called the Freedom Rides. Even though the Supreme Court had said segregation violates the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, states and local officials found ways to go around this ruling. So in order to get the national government, the federal government involved, people had to prove that these local officials and these local governments were violating the federal government. So what they planned to do was get on an interstate bus and ride between the states from one state to another. Because once that happens, the federal government has authority. So in 1961, these interstate bus rides occurred. They were called the Freedom Rides. It ended up that it was incredibly hateful what some of these people experienced. The idea was that they would get on the buses in the north and ride them down through the south into South Carolina, into Alabama. And when they got off the bus, or when people saw that African Americans were sitting next to white people, a lot of them were beat up. There were some arrests made. Now, Bobby Kennedy, he was the attorney general at the time. His brother was president. He had a meeting with this guy, James Farmer, who was a member of the Congress of Racial Equality. And they had a meeting, and Bobby Kennedy said, hey, we need to do something to solve this problem. We need a period of cooling off. Let's cool off for a little bit. Let's take it slowly, call off the Freedom Rides. And James Farmer gets really into it, and he goes, cool off? We've been cooling off for 350 years. If we cool off any more, we'll be in a deep freeze. I like putting this in there because it shows this was a time of action. All this stuff had been going on for so long that now, with some of the changes, a lot more is going to start happening. Now, there were divisions within the civil rights movement. I'm sorry, here's 350. Cool off. We've been cooling off for 350 years. There were divisions within the civil rights movement. Okay, some of the younger African Americans grew impatient. One man that is associated with this impatience is Malcolm X. Malcolm X believed in violence as a means of social protest. Malcolm X was against integration. We don't need to mix with these people. He was a member of the Nation of Islam, also known as the Black Muslims. And in reaction to this idea of integration, he said, wait a second, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. They forced us here. Why should we have to mix with them now? In fact, for a while, he called for getting out of the United States. But one of the pillars of Islam is that every Muslim has to go back to Mecca once in their life. And when Malcolm X was in Mecca, he had a change of heart. It was in Mecca that he saw white people and black people praying together. And when he came back to the United States from his pilgrimage to Mecca, he called for a society in which there could exist honest white black brotherhood. This scared some of the members of the Nation of Islam, and ultimately he was assassinated by rivals within the Nation of Islam. Another famous person, Stokely Carmichael, he was a leader of a group called SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He had pride and promoted pride in African heritage. He promoted black power and black separatism, again, creating different cultures and different political institutions, again, against integration. There was fury and frustration. Some people didn't like this nonviolent movement, and ultimately riots erupted. This has taken too long. We've been going at this too long, and there's not enough change. So there were riots in 1965 in Watts, in San Francisco, in Chicago, in Cleveland, in Newark, New Jersey. Finally, there is some legislation that is passed, laws enacted. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination in employment, in voting, in public accommodations. So, no more of this whites-only restrooms and whites-only water fountains. It prohibited discrimination based on race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. And, very importantly, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Very important, because this is where the federal government was actually given the power to force local officials to allow African Americans to register to vote. Again, voting is very key here. How do you change things? You vote. In order to vote, you have to be able to register to vote. And because there were still local laws in effect, they could kind of change things to make it difficult for African Americans to register to vote. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave the federal government the power to force local officials to allow African Americans to register to vote. That is a lot of information. It went on a lot longer than I originally expected. Again, you've got some information about key people and events. You have examples of citizens and groups who have influenced change, and you have some ideas about how to effectively voice opinions. This has been another amazing McWayne's Class production, His Macadocious Incorporated.